All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro Podcast. We've got actually two special guests on the show with us today. So first we have in the top left corner, Dr. Elena Buglo, who is a neuroscientist and neurogeneticist who works in gene therapy for rare diseases. She has vast interests in consciousness and cognitive neuroscience. She's originally from Russia and used to be a lawyer before her transition into neuroscience. And down at the bottom, we have Dr. Nizar Taki, who is a plastic surgeon turned life coach and a self-described student of human consciousness. Dr. Taki is also an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. He leads webinars which discuss topics related to stress, consciousness, and the nature of reality. And for those longtime Roscoe's Wetsuit listeners, you guys probably recognize Nizar. He's been a guest on a couple shows before, so welcome back. And for Elena, welcome to Roscoe's Wetsuit.
Thanks for the invitation. Very glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So what I wanted to get started with is a discussion on consciousness, which, you know, it's kind of a mystery in terms of neuroscience. We haven't been able to exactly say, you know, this brain region causes consciousness to occur. There's different theories as far as what in the brain is producing consciousness. And I'd like to hear each of your guys' perspectives on kind of consciousness and, you know, that mystery in neuroscience.
So what a great question. I guess I'll start. I've had a vast interest in understanding consciousness ever since I've been conscious. And I think it's a grand mystery, both for science and spirituality. And throughout my path, I've been really trying to marry the two to find both the explanation for myself as a spiritual human being and a scientist, and the explanation for all of us, really. So going back to some of my earlier days when I was in neuroanatomy classes, and I think I'm sure Nizar probably had a similar experience. You let me know when we were in a group of students and we were brought a brain in formamide on a plate, and we dissected that brain. Right. Many students were curious and, you know, digging in, looking into this mass of jelly, of this jelly-like matter. And I was utterly shocked. I think I had a very profound experience of realizing that someone's whole was potentially, as presented by the neuroscience view, by the major mainstream neuroscience understanding, was encapsulated somehow in this brain, or was processed through this piece of matter. And it was utterly shocking to even think that this matter can create the whole life experience, which is the major view, right? I'm only referring to the major view of neuroscience as of today. The whole experience of life, such as love, connection, friendship, the experience, the qualia, or what we call the experience of the feeling of life, like the taste of food, the touch, the smell of a favorite perfume, the smell of the flower, the whole grandesque visual experience that we go through every day in nature and in everyday life. And it is what is called the hard problem of consciousness. It is hard. It's hard to even encompass how this matter can produce such an incredible experience of life, and it's all life as we know it. Life is all we know. This 86 something billion neurons and the same number of glial cells that can produce this human experience. And it is still a huge, a big, remarkable question in science is considering all of the neural correlates of consciousness, does the brain truly yet explain this experience of human nature? Does the brain generate it? And there are other theories of consciousness that, such as panpsychism, right, Nizar? Maybe you could elaborate on this a little more, where it's considered or it's viewed as consciousness can be present in everything. The consciousness is the quality of this space-time reality, and it penetrates throughout in every atom. And there are theories that kind of like somewhere in between. I don't know, Nizar, what do you think, and what do you like to add to this?
Well, I think as scientists, if we want to be true scientists when it comes to everything, and especially consciousness, then to me, being a true scientist means not having any pre-existing assumptions when you're trying to answer a question. And unfortunately, when scientists approach consciousness, they do come with it with a lot of pre-existing assumptions, and it makes it really hard to talk about the topic. For example, if somebody hands you a brain and they say, here, this is where consciousness comes from, that's a pre-existing assumption. But I understand why people have that assumption, because I'm a doctor and I've seen patients who, get shot in the head and they're not conscious because their brain has a hole in it. Or if you remove a piece of somebody's brain, they seem to change how they're expressing themselves, how they're consciously expressing themselves. As their brain gets more injured, their consciousness seems to decrease. They become more and more unconscious. And so then I understand why there's that assumption because of these correlations. But there's also a saying in statistics, and I was a statistics major, and that really influenced my view on the world, that correlation does not equal causation. And it really helps to step back and not have any pre-existing assumptions. Specifically with consciousness and the brain, if I have a TV and there's like a news program playing on it, and I punch the TV and I break the speaker and now there's no sound coming out, I don't assume that there's a news person inside the TV and that's where the news broadcast is coming from. It's not being created by the TV. Or if I punch the screen and now there's no picture on the screen, I don't assume that there's a guy in there that's now dead or that now can't speak because I broke the screen. We all understand that the television is transmitting something, it's receiving a signal from elsewhere, and it's allowing us to perceive that signal. And yes, if you break a transmitter, if you break the speaker on the TV, or you break the screen, or you unplug it, then the signal goes away. But that doesn't mean that the news person that you're seeing on the TV is inside the TV. It just means that they're receiving something from elsewhere. And I'm not saying that this is how consciousness works. I'm just saying that it makes sense that consciousness, that the brain could be a tool that our consciousness uses to interact with the world. But we have many, many documented reports of near-death experiences, which means people whose brains stopped working and documented that they stopped working, who were still able to be conscious and perceive what was happening in the room, which suggests that same thing I'm talking about. If you break the TV, the news person doesn't just go away, or the signal that's creating the news person doesn't go away. And there's a lot of evidence for that in the near-death experience studies, and in out-of-body experience studies. But with science, we have somebody called this phenomena. He basically described it as a phenomena where when something really weird happens, we just say no, it's not possible, and we ignore it if it doesn't fit in with our accepted paradigms. And that's not real science. You know, you have to, even if there's an outlier, especially if there's more than one, you can't just push them aside. Rather, it may mean that you have to change your existing worldview.
Absolutely. You know, Nizar, I agree so much with you on that. And I'd like to touch upon a few things that you said. First of all, I also think, even logically, from a logical perspective, that of course we have all the knowledge, like as you said, the pre-existing assumptions of that we're basing as scientists our scientific understanding of the worldview upon, and it really comes from, you know, theory of evolution, that is, and for me as a geneticist as well, it is, there's just so much data to see it and to understand that we are evolved biological beings based on interactions with environment, right? A whole knowledge of evolution, the variants that come up in genetics. And for me also as a geneticist, it's interesting to ponder about our consciousness based on genetic variability as well. Let's say out of 6-something billion base pairs of human DNA, which only maybe 1 to 3% of it is coding regions. But out of this 6-something billion base pairs, letters of DNA that create a whole, you know, this biological body, which not only has genes that produce proteins structurally and functionally, but also adapts to environment in epigenetic ways. Only one base pair change in an essential gene, or, you know, for dominant diseases and for recessive disease, like 2 base pair changes that are pathogenic, can lead to the most devastating disease, which will lead to the most devastating and morbid experience, the personal experience of a human being. Let's say, for example, diseases of spinal muscular atrophy or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So those rare genetic diseases that create a body that is not, you know, not functional as to enjoy and to the reality as we would call on average a healthy person would process and experience. And then, like right now, I'm working in neurotransmitter diseases, a disease of metabolism that is also genetic. So it is also extremely devastating in ways that people, children with these diseases cannot experience reality as a normal person would whatsoever. They don't develop movement, or they're not able to interact with the environment whatsoever. So this poses a great question as well of consciousness, also in the ways of variability, not only genetic but environmental, the variability of our cultural upbringing, the variability of our experience that leads us to a specific time in space where our personality or the human existence experiences the personal reality around us and within us. So this is one interesting problem that I see as an experiencer of reality that comes from biological nature of human being. Yet, I really like, there was a biologist, Thomas Huxley, in 19th century, who said, how incredible that something as remarkable as appearance of consciousness through irritating the nervous tissue comes about as unaccountable as a genie appearing from rubbing a lamp. So is the mind really only there for the ride with the brain? So very interesting topic that you've mentioned is most certainly those outlier experiences that do not fit into the understanding of science as we know it, which is, of course, the materialistic worldview, and that is based upon, biochemistry, biology, and then physics, mathematics of the universe. So this is a very interesting question, and I would like to mention that there are scientists who are not necessarily mainstream, and they still use scientific method in order to approach this understanding, and that study those near-death experiences, those experiences of non-local perception, and like such as telepathy, of course, the connectedness of consciousness, which is a really mysteriously intricate question. And for myself, in my personal scientific human experience, I've been deeply convinced, like I've seen enough data for myself that is both, and sometimes you don't need really more than n of one when experience is profoundly real and true to you. That would change your own personal lifetime and perception for yourself. Right, that reminds me of this movie. I don't know if you guys watched it. This movie called I Origin. Have you guys watched it? You watched it? Do you remember
Yes.
how there's this scientist who was looking for a gene that was responsible for the creation of the eye, But there's also the interplay of words, like the I origin, the origin of the I or the self, and he goes through a personal experience. Well, I don't want to spoil the movie, but through personal experience where his loved one dies, and he is searching for that loved one through the eyes, based on the theory that this woman possibly reincarnated as a girl in a different country. And when he encounters that N of one experience that proves to him that it is her indeed reincarnated, it's like his whole scientific view just collapses, right? Because it is so meaningful that he doesn't need N of three to have a statistical significance that is personally meaningful and profound. That as you referred to those anecdotal experiences of the near-death experiences, this is also very true. And I also remember it's obviously hard to study. You cannot induce a near-death experience in a lab, right? It's very hard to catch it, perhaps. Also, not everybody would have a near-death experience when they go to coma. As far as I know, it's only like 30% or so of people that report it. And yet I remember again, hearing this anecdotal case of one near-death experience when a blind woman, blind for her whole lifetime, she never seen with her physical eyes, she was able to describe everything that she saw correctly, precisely in her near-death experience, like to describe, the surgeons or the nurses and what they said and how she saw the scene. And she came back again into a body that couldn't see with the biological eyes. So also having my personal experience, I would just say something as profound that has convinced yourself that the world is not necessarily the way we know it in mainstream science can change, it can change everything for ourselves as scientists, as people who try to explain this reality, and to perhaps to entice other scientists to look into that. And I would like to compliment one of my favorite scientists called Dean Redding, who is studying telepathy, studying, they're doing some experience on quantum number generators, and some other experiments also with participation of observer of the reality to understand how it changes, like the collapse of the quantum function, basically, which we don't have to get into, but it really means that consciousness can affect, indeed, the matter. So with consciousness, perhaps, could be primary to matter, which takes it outside of the materialistic worldview, or somehow it married as well. It just kind of shifts the perspectives of where consciousness comes, rather than being an epiphenomena of the brain. Could it be, as you were describing, the perceiver, the processor? Could the brain be the perceiver and the processor of the consciousness?
I wanted to ask you guys a follow-up question, very similar to a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, Elena, related to, we all experience the world, through our own filters, subjectively. But there's also a lot of talk about, kind of finding the true nature of reality. So I want to hear your guys' opinions on this, as far as how do we go about, kind of moving beyond our own worldview, our own beliefs, and thoughts about, ourselves and other people and the world around us, to actually move into kind of understanding this sort of true nature of reality. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Nizar, you want to go?
Yeah, I think it starts with, well, first there's the understanding that there is no one reality, in a sense, because we all have our own subjective bubble, and so we experience, you even you yourself will experience the same situation differently depending on, what mood you're in, how much sleep you got, what you're thinking about at that time, let alone like a completely different person with a whole different set of experiences and etc. But I think the reason that our subjective realities are so different is because we don't have, you're right, we don't have an accurate view of what reality is. Meaning that we come to reality with a set of assumptions, and the assumptions that most of humans have right now is that reality is a time that you spend on this earth, and then you have a limited time, and then you die. And then depending on your belief system, either you might, maybe your belief system says you go to heaven if you were good, and then you go to hell if you're bad. Maybe your belief system says you get reincarnated, or maybe you believe that this is just it and there's nothing after this, and everything just is gone, and after you die, and this is your one shot. And unfortunately, our world is set up so that you either believe in like religion, let's say, like you believe in, one of the major religions. And then there's more and more people who are so-called spiritual, who don't ascribe to a religion. But for most people, if you're not religious, then they're, atheist, or, I believe in science, meaning I don't believe in a God or an afterlife, or anything that exists beyond this specific physical body. And I think we just need to get rid of all the assumptions, not say that it's what religion says, not say that it's what science says, and start asking more questions, and instead of just saying that we know the answers. Like all the phenomena that Elena, you were talking about, I think a lot of people who hear about them would say, oh, no, that's impossible. That couldn't exist. And the question isn't or not whether or not those phenomena are real or exist, but the question is, why are you just saying that something is impossible? It's because you've already ascribed to a set of assumptions. So I'm not saying that people should need to start assuming certain things are real that they didn't believe before, but it's just maybe your perspective on reality isn't what you thought what you think it is. Maybe reality isn't what it appears to be. And if you think about, I mean, to me, what made me realize this was when I thought about my dreams. Like when I'm asleep and I'm dreaming, all kinds of crazy stuff could be happening. And I'm totally, in the dream, I believe it's real. I don't realize that I'm dreaming until I wake up and I think, wow, that was a crazy dream. I can't believe I thought that was real. And yet then we go about our daily lives, you know, in a world where science really hasn't explained how our consciousness is creating reality, hasn't explained how the Big Bang created the universe, hasn't explained so many things, and yet we just take it for granted that it all makes sense and it's normal. But who's to say that at the end of this life, an equivalent thing isn't going to happen where your consciousness wakes up somewhere else, maybe in another dimension, maybe in a room on a space, maybe like in the Matrix or something. But basically, who's to say that you're not going to wake up after this life somewhere else or as something else and say, oh my God, that was a crazy dream or crazy reality or whatever it was? Because we have that experience every single night and when we wake up. So just start questioning, and then you'll start getting, well, at least we can all agree that we have no idea what reality is, and that's closer to the truth than we all are now with our own separate like stable and rock solid beliefs that are actually founded on shaky assumptions.
Yeah, it sounds like,
it's really fascinating.
yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, it sounds like, you know, the Nizar, what you're saying is kind of just challenging some of those core beliefs. I think, you know, that's something a lot of people, maybe not in the fields that we're in, I think a lot of people don't even come to think of, you know, the fact that their experience of reality is subjective, and that someone else who they're having a disagreement with, that, you know, is actually seeing the world through a different lens, and they don't understand that the way they're seeing things is different than the way I'm seeing things. Anyways, Elena, I'm curious, what's your take on both what Nizar said along with just the original question that I posed?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's so much mystery and magnificence in this question. I find it utterly fascinating and unfathomable how consciousness can be this everything that we know, and for each of you, for each of us, it is yet so different. So no matter how culturally similar we are, no matter how physically similar we are, biological, genetically similar we are, perhaps the upbringing was very similar, the connections between our neurons is similar. Let's say if we're twins, right? Like the zygotic twins. No matter how we feel as we are right next to one another, looking at the same thing, or listening, hearing the same piece of music, experiencing the reality in this togetherness, yet our experience will be very different. You know, and I find it so fascinating, and I'm constantly longing in my life experience for this idea of shared reality. We seem to be in a shared reality, yet for each of us it is different. And it's just, there's no answer to this question. It's just incredible and fascinating. not only we experience it as so differently, but I think we, as humans, are longing for the sense of, deep connection and understanding of each other. And one of the characteristics of consciousness, which we haven't even touched upon the definition of consciousness, and nobody has a definition, as a spoiler, yet we're longing for this coherence in understanding that we are sharing somehow the similar perception, the similar experience of life when we are sharing this personal local reality together, even by Zoom. That somehow we are right this in this moment, no matter what it is that is again running on the background of our also unconscious, and how much we slept and what we ate and what kind of drama we went through, or what kind of excitement we went through earlier in life or in the day. Somehow we're here sharing the same reality that is yet so dissimilar. So what I am being really fascinated by is that resonance that occurs between humans in these transcendental experiences of human connection. Not necessarily human, actually. I think in my own experience, I've experienced with my loved pet, with my dog, or even with nature. Yet the observer, that idea, the concept of the observer, of the conscious agent, as opposed to a robot or an AI that is somehow present and is generating the somewhat fox experience of understanding. Imagine if one of you guys was an AI and we're here, and I'm really trying to relate to you. I'm really trying to be like, are you getting what I'm saying? Are you understanding this concept, that idea? And then the moment when you get me, there's this coherence occurs. And in physics, it is, or as much as I can relate to as an allegory or a metaphor, or maybe even a true description of the consciousness, if consciousness is somewhat a wave-like nature of reality that penetrates the whole ether of space and time, it is this moment of resonance. When there are natural frequencies, like every object has natural frequencies, and the moment when these natural frequencies align and overlap, the resonance may occur. So from the amplitude that is this small, in the moment of resonance, when waves overlap, the intensity, the amplitude of the wave goes way higher. So this is called resonance in physics. And there was examples in history where the bridge collapsed, I think somewhere Oregon, right, somewhere in the West, when the natural frequency of the bridge matched the natural frequency of the wind passing, and the whole bridge structure collapsed as it started wobbling. And the same, I think, very similar experience with very few times in my lifetime when I would have this incredible transcendental moments of coherence and resonance with other humans that would feel so true, and that as if nothing else before and after was as true and real as this observation of witnessing of reality as shared reality, being able to almost like the coherence of consciousness, or consciousness that somehow overlaps and renders this expansion of truth, like universal beauty and love or whatnot. It was just experience of things being even more real than they seem to be. And then the moment to moment in everyday life, there's so many fluctuations of how we experience reality, like the coherence. So one of the definitions of consciousness is somehow there's a coherence of experience, and also, like, we can just talk about a little bit about definitions, like there are definitions of consciousness that refer to self-consciousness. So the I, the understanding of the I, like there's I'm Elena, Dr. Buglo, there's Dr. Taki, and everything that belongs to I, right? My story, um, everything that I am, everything that I do, my qualities and characteristics that are somewhat, um, accumulated to have some coherence. And yet there's so many fluctuations. And yet consciousness exists even without I. And yet somehow consciousness falls or dissipates into nothingness when we go to deep sleep. And the brain waves that are associated with our conscious perception while we're conscious are very different, yet the activity of the brain, like going back to neural correlates of the brain and consciousness, yet the activity of the brain, like brain is as active awake as it's active asleep, but the brain waves and the like the correlations or the talking between different regions of the brain is like a little slower and less coherent during sleep. And then there are periods of rapid eye movement when we see the dreams. And again, when we see the dreams, is there really, another question, is there really an I? Is it the same person that you coherently waking up to, that you seem to be the same person every day? Is it the same person in your dreams? So this question was asked before, and often it's some kind of like nondescript person. It's not exactly the personality that we wake up to go back to on a daily basis. So all of this are still open-ended questions. And I only talk about it to share all this fascination because I really don't know the answer to any of these questions.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think some of the most interesting questions are the ones, that don't have a clear answer that we can talk about and ponder, and that philosophers and neuroscientists and, spirituality people have pondered for, all of humanity. I wanted to talk about a similar kind of concept related to the ego. And I know a lot of people, kind of in this sort of spirituality, the bridge between kind of spirituality and neuroscience, people talking about, the ego being bad and kind of striving for ego death with a variety of different, I guess, mechanisms. But there's also, on the other hand, people who say the ego actually serves a lot of really useful functions. I wanted to hear each of your guys' opinions on the ego, and is it good, is it bad, or somewhere in between?
That's a great point. And I like that you included, because I used to be, as you learn about this stuff, you first learn about the ego and try to get rid of it. We got to get rid of our ego. But you can't. I mean, first of all, what is the ego? I think there's different definitions, and I think mine changes constantly, but one great definition is it's the story that you tell about yourself. And from a neuroscience standpoint, we have two hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left. And the left brain is the part of your brain that speaks. It has the language center. And it's thought that with the evolution of language, we started being able to describe things and label things, including things outside of us and ourselves. And actually, our perception of time as humans also coincided with the ability to use language, because if you think about like animals and humans, maybe before we had language, the only thing that existed was the present moment. But with language, you could label directions like left, right, forward, back. And if you look at the way we think of time, we think of it in terms of space. Like if I tell you to imagine the past and the future, and the present moment, you'll imagine a line with, the future usually on the right and the past on the left. interestingly, in languages where scripts go in the opposite direction, the location of the past and the future are reversed, or maybe they're up and down. So we used language to help us develop a time, like a timeline. And so this, something that happened in the past now could be kind of remembered and labeled, and things that we did in the past could now be remembered and labeled, and then we could be labeled. So I could start saying, oh, I'm the type of person that does this, or my name is this, and I do that, and I like that, and I don't like this. And this, as this gets more and more complicated, we create a complicated story of ourselves, and then others also have their own stories of us, which we may take into account for our story. And over time it evolves, and we start playing into the role of the story that we created until we forget that it's just a story, and we actually start believing that it's really who we are. So I think you need it in the sense that same way that you need to think about the past and the future, and like you can't interact with me unless you have a story about me, and I need to kind of know that story so that I can interact with people on a day-to-day basis. In that sense, it's good. And if I didn't have an ego at all, then probably I would be more like, I would probably be difficult. I would not be able to be in a society like ours, and I'd be more like I don't know, like
I know,
uh,
Nizar. I was just
basically,
thinking it would be so inconvenient to call you every time, and you would be like a different person each time, or like a nondescript somebody.
it'd be like, um,
We wouldn't have
I'd
ability
be
to
like, I don't know,
interact.
the people that grow up in like raised by wolves or whatever, that kind of a person. Uh,
Mm.
I think it's a great question. What does it mean to totally not have an ego? I think we need it to function in society. But I think the other issue is when your ego is too solid and too much of who you are, then you start repeating past behaviors that are not helpful, when in reality you could respond in a different way. And so the important thing about the ego is not to not have one, but to realize that it's malleable. And Elena and I had this conversation recently, and I think this is the best way to think about the ego, is it's like a role that an actor takes when they're on a stage. So when an actor pretends to be a character, they have to step into that role. And in a sense, while they're on the stage, they forget, they literally take on the emotions of that character and that character's story, so that they can communicate something to the audience and make the audience feel something. But what they don't do is they don't think that they're actually that character when they, both when they're on the stage and when they're off the stage. When they finish the act, they don't go off stage and keep pretending to be that character. So, and then when it's a time for another production, they might be a completely different character. And so a good actor can shift from one character to another, depending on the play, depending on the scene, but they're able to step into that role fully. And I think, I like to think of ego as that, as it's the story that we tell ourselves, but most people just have this one story and they don't even realize it's a story. They think it's fact. Whereas truly living life to the fullest entails being able to choose your story based on the moment and what serves you best, and never completely forgetting that you're creating a story, because then you're going to be limited by that story, because the same story isn't going to work for every situation. Whereas somebody without an ego at all might not be able to experience a full range of the drama of life, so to speak. So there you have it. That's my way of thinking about it, and I'm still formulating it as to what it means, but that seems to work for me.
Well, you're still formulating it because you don't have that big of an ego that all of your your thoughts are solidified, right?
Exactly. No, I mean, that's the thing, is I never to say that I know something like this is what it is. I always just say this is what it seems like it might be to me. And if it resonates with other people, then great. But like, again, my training was in statistics, and with statistics, you can never be 100% sure about anything. We always say, you know, there's a 99% probability that it's this, but there's always that chance that it's not. And I think that's the best way to come at this stuff, is say, this is what it seems like, but I'm always open to revising it if a better definition or a more complete perspective comes along. And I don't think we'll ever have the full answer, but we'll always evolve.
What's your take on the ego, Elena?
Yeah, that's such a grand question. There are many interesting parts of this question that I could elaborate upon, and also obviously don't know the answer. I'm not going to give you any answers, but just some of the interesting questions that surround the idea of ego is again coming back to understanding of what is self-consciousness, right? Is the idea, is ego equating to self-consciousness? Is it understanding of the self and the perception of the self-construct, right? Or maybe it's probably not, but it's one of the definitions of maybe subdivisions of what consciousness is. But then in my understanding, my idea of ego, so much, the big part of ego is unconscious, and also our experience, our everyday experience of life there's only like the consciousness of what we are conscious about, or like where our attention goes out of everything that we perceive around us. There is probably like over 90% that is unconscious, and we still perceive it, and we may still react to it also as, you know, biological beings, whether it is something stressful, whether it's the gloomy weather that's right now outside making feel uncomfortable somewhere on the inside, whether it's some other underlying issue like, you know, lack of sleep, or some other bothering issue that is on the back of the mind, but you're not fully conscious about it, as it is again unconscious. So I think ego, to me, as Nizar was describing, it has these stories, but a lot of stories are unconscious. And this is very interesting conversation going back to the split brain, right, Nizar? When right hemisphere would have one understanding of the story, when the left hemisphere would have a different understanding. And the language centers, which you will also describe and have evolved in order to serve, of course, our communication and also self-perception, they are situated on the left, in the left hemisphere. They're localized to the left hemisphere, which is one of the only differences that we know of between right and left brain, really, is in this localization of the language perception and language producing centers. So to give an example, maybe Nizar, do you remember of like a good example of this incoherence between perception of left and right brain?
You mean in terms of the studies that were done on it, or meaning like
the studies? Let's say how the left brain comes up with stories, right? When you ask something, I don't know, just a little more background. There used to be this surgery that would cut the corpus callosum to reduce the number of epileptic seizures, to reduce the epileptic seizure activity in the brain in patients. And once they were divided somehow, so the two hemispheres, again, they were separated, right? They didn't have the white matter connection tracks that would allow hemispheres to communicate. And yet when the patient would come out of anesthesia, he would still appear to have the same coherent consciousness when interacting with reality, with, you know, both eyes, both ears. But when the perception was separated for the experiments, so they were the guinea pigs for the doctors to experiment on. So the perception was separated, let's say, by the visual field, and the stimuli was presented to one hemisphere, to, let's say, to the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere didn't know what it was, but somehow it knew, and somehow it would still explain by whichever story was appropriate. Let's say there was something about chickens and
Yeah,
shovels, right?
yeah, like yeah. That one example is okay. That one's a good one. A simple example is they would do something like they can give instructions to one hemisphere by speaking it into the ear on that side, I believe. So if the hemispheres are disconnected, if
Mm-hmm.
you were to whisper something into the right ear, let's say, it only goes to the right hemisphere. So they would tell the right hemisphere, get up and walk out of the room, right? And so the hemisphere is still connected to your body, so you get up and start walking out of the room. But when they ask you, why did you leave the room? The speaking hemisphere is the left hemisphere, and it doesn't know the reason why the right hemisphere chose to just get up and start walking out of the room. But instead of being confused, like, I don't know, that's really strange, it just comes up with an excuse like, I wanted to go get a Coke, which actually, and so before I turn it back to you, I just realized when I was struggling to think of what would it be like to not have an ego, there's a TED Talk in a book called My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor, who is a neuroscientist, and she had a left hemisphere stroke and basically was aware during the whole process and could describe what her experience was like. And I'll let whoever is listening to this look up the TED Talk or check out the book themselves just to see what it's like. But her description of when her left hemisphere goes offline, I think is a very accurate description of what ego death is and what it's like not to have an ego. And if you follow what she's saying, it makes sense that like you wouldn't be able to really function in the world without having an ego.
Mm-hmm.
It used to feel really good, but it doesn't seem conducive to functioning in the world. And the opposite would happen if you have a right brain stroke, where your left brain is now sort of in control of everything. And what happens there is what's called hemi-neglect syndrome, which Elena knows
Mm-hmm.
all about this as well. But basically, the entire left half of the world, because the left half of the world is perceived by the right hemisphere because it crosses over, is just non-existent. Not that you can't see it, it just, your left brain will create a story that says everything on the other side that the right brain is perceiving just doesn't exist. So, when they have to, when they're asked to draw, draw the numbers on the face of a clock, they're all drawn on the right side. Or when, let's say their arm is paralyzed because of the stroke, it would be their left arm that's paralyzed because that's controlled by the right brain. And if you ask them, hey, can you move your arm? They'll say yes, even though they can't. And that's the left brain sort of fabricating a story. And then when you show them their arm and say, look, this is your arm, can you move it? And they'll say, that's not my arm, that's my neighbor's arm. And so basically it's showing that the left brain, which they've called a part of it called the left brain interpreter, its only job, which it's really good at, is coming up with stories to explain what's in front of us, even if those stories aren't true. And we can't exactly turn it off, but once we start realizing that that's what's happening, we begin to know that we don't always have to take those stories seriously, and we start seeing alternate explanations of what might be happening. So
Yeah, this is so interesting. I would like to touch upon a few things you said. Um, again, like going back to knowing that, right? Knowing this experiments, having this experience in account, going back to this theory, again, is the brain the producer, the generator of the consciousness, or is it the processor, the perceiver and the processor, right? Imagine the part of the processor goes off and now the consciousness just flows again, like without the ego construct, let's say, potentially through the right hemisphere, or somehow that some of the centers are shut off and these other ones are being able to process consciousness by different means or by different tools. Also, going back to the brain and understanding of consciousness, first of all, we all assume that we are, as humans, conscious. But then there is all this variability in the ways that we, even on a daily basis, right, experience like how conscious we really are. And sometimes I would talk to my friends and they'd be like, well, he's not conscious. He's not as conscious as this one. And I would gravitate more to more conscious friends, right? What does it really mean? What does it really entail? Then other questions that
Your friends
come.
dating people in coma.
Exactly, coma. And then, well, there's just so many interesting things I want to touch upon. So other questions are children conscious, right? Well, are they developing consciousness as the brain is developing and being myelinated, which means they, the and like the neural connections that be reaching out and forming neural circuits and then being pruned. And then, as we know, in disorders of autism, the neural connections outgrow so much and the pruning doesn't happen as efficaciously. So there's just too much connectedness, and those children are not, their consciousness is not the same as what we would think of a normal, healthy person, child. Then how is the consciousness appearing and evolving in from an infancy in a child, right? And how does the ego construct evolving? We know that children, even when they start to speak, they speak of themselves as the third person perspective. So the that I origin comes a little later on. I don't remember exactly, I'm not a cognitive neuroscience, but I think it's around the age of 5 or 6, where it's more of a I comes in, maybe earlier. But in the beginning, there's very little understanding. So the ego is forming. And then all these experiences that Nizar was also mentioning that shape our stories, and a lot of them unconscious stories. Again, people can have unconscious trauma or unconscious programming that happens on the neurobiological level, and their memory is shut off. Their conscious perception, or like basically the knowing that it existed, is completely shut off because the memory could be painful and unpleasant, right? That's why there's like some traumas of being molested or being in an accident that are completely shut off from memory because they're just, well, I don't know why, because the brain is evolved to out of fear to not access those memories. So another question is that we're getting into in terms of consciousness is yes, there's fluctuations between consciousness of a human versus consciousness of animals, right? And if we do describe consciousness as perception, like do animals have ego? I think my dog has an ego. Like my dog has a very defined personality. We know that octopus as an animal is extremely intelligent too. And like again, like what is the correlation between intelligence and consciousness? But it perceives reality also as we know of, as we have studied them in a more advanced way than many other animals. So this is just very interesting questions. Coming back to ego, what happens to moments of ego dissolution that is described by those different tools that we were referring to, right, in the studies by John Hopkins University, the studies of using high doses of psilocybin in patients and studies of ego dissolution and what happens to the brain on MRI when during the psychedelic experience, during that ego dissolution, right? And to mention that they report these experiences as top like 1% of experiences of their lifetime, most memorable, most transforming experiences of their lifetime, those moments of ego dissolution. How incredible is that? So, and what happens to the brain in those experiences is, again, as has been studied, is the increase in interconnectedness. Like the whole brain lights up in the ways that is known being hasn't connected before. So the action potential is just go into different parts of the brain throughout the prefrontal cortex or visual cortex as well. A lot of activity. But then what also is interesting is, like, after the psychedelic experience that is being studied, the stronger reintegration of those networks occurs. So the ego reintegration is somehow even stronger. And I cannot even explain it specifically. I don't really know what it means, but this is what has been studied. So ego is so interesting, as Nizar mentioned. The stories, if we, as Carl Jung would say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life, and you'll call it fate. So until we uncover those Pandora boxes of unconscious stories, whether they're conscious or unconscious, and would bring them up to the surface of the consciousness, so shine the light of consciousness in those darkness of reactions, neurobiological, like emotions, feelings that come up when a certain stimuli is presented. Let's say you were, bit by a dog when you were a child, and maybe you forgot about it, but then the person would always be feeling fear reaction to dogs, right? Or maybe spiders, like aragophobia. And we realize that we can break that not only the brain is plastic, whether it is a processor or generator of reality and consciousness, but we do know that we can change that this is accessible. And even, like, we know that we can use also those altered states of decoherence of the ego and the stories as having huge potentiality, having remarkable potentiality in changing and reintegration, or changing the story, reintegration of life experience. Let's say in patients with PTSD who use whether like ketamine or psilocybin to change that very unconscious reaction, the traumatic reaction that occurs when presented with a stimulus. If your friend died at war in front of you, you're not going to be, consciously being able necessarily to change it in a regular state of mind. But those experiences of altered consciousness, they hold the capacity for the open state of mind, and they don't only occur in psychedelics. It could be just a very experience in real life that is just somehow is profound and meaningful. And then also going back to the idea, this concept of meaning, what is consciousness in a way that is it describing meaning that is connected to a feeling, that is connected to emotion, that is connected to a feeling of life? Like, Nizar is my friend, Toby is my friend. Like for Nizar, again, because of the coherence of his ego that he has been showing up for me in every conversation that I've had with him, like it's been somewhat the same Nizar, even though he's changing and evolving, and I've been somewhat the same Elena, and some changing and evolving. But then there's this meaning that I assign to this friendship, to this specific connection with this human being. And there are moments, let's just say, example from neuroscience, disorders of consciousness. Dr. Ramachandran from California Tech University, I believe, he studies this interesting disorders of consciousness. He talks about, I think it's called Capgras syndrome. So it describes, again, when the person is convinced that the person that they know is an imposter is not a real friend, or is not his mother, is not his father or wife or husband. And it is only occurs, is a very intricate syndrome. Let's say when, for example, this man, when he saw his mother, he would say, "It's not my mother, it's an imposter." But if she called him on the phone, he would immediately recognize her by hearing her voice and be like, "Oh my God, mother, where have you been?" But if he saw her in person, he would be completely disintegrated, unable to perceive her as a dear person, where all of the memories and feelings and experience of life that is connected with the mother somehow is cut off because of the brain malfunction. So I know
I
I've
wrote
seen quite a lot. Hmm.
my high school like psychology class. We had to write a paper, and I wrote mine on Capgras syndrome because it was so fascinating.
It is.
And I'll just add that how Capgras syndrome occurs is usually a lesion in the left brain, or sorry, in the right
Mm,
brain. So
it
the
is.
right brain has the part of your brain that recognizes faces. So take that for what you will, but that's what causes it.
Hmm.
So
I
the
know.
last the last question, because I know we're coming up onto the end of the show, but the last question I want to posit to you guys, and thank you, Elena, for bringing up psychedelics, because that's actually what I wanted to ask you guys about, is what do psychedelics and other transcendent experiences teach us about consciousness, metaphysics, and just the brain? And I know that's a very kind of huge question, but you guys can take that wherever you want to go with it.
All right, I can start with this one. I think, you know, I'm just going to start with, I'm just going to say the basics. Like for somebody that's never tried psychedelics or doesn't know anything about them, I'll say this. Psychedelics create an experience of through consciousness that is unlike anything that you've experienced before. And to me, like, that just shows that there's more to it than we don't understand. So like at the very basic thing, what you can say is like, there's a mode that our brain can operate in that for some reason we don't get to experience aside from in these specific states. And there are people who can experience these modes without psychedelics, but it's difficult. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of training. And then there's people who experience them because of trauma or in times of, you know, high stress.
Hmm.
But and the sun is setting here, that's why it's all getting darker around me.
Mine too.
Um, but I'd like to, you know, I just like to start with that, is that there's more to it than our baseline consciousness. And when you become aware of that and you actually experience that, you start realizing that maybe, yeah, again, maybe we don't have a full explanation for it, because again, science doesn't explain why does psilocybin create the experience that it does? Why does ketamine create the experience that it does in patients who are undergoing, you know, psychedelic therapy with it? And yeah, we have like, okay, so we know the molecules and maybe we know where they act, and maybe we can do an MRI of the brain while it's happening and we see that it's all lighting up. But that doesn't explain the subjective experience of it. And that subjective experience, at the very least, does what the stroke did for Jill Bolte Taylor. And I'll have you, if you could put the link in the description, that way people can check out her TED Talk, which again, it's called My Stroke of Insight. It just shows her that there is a lot more to her consciousness than she could perceive in any one given moment. And in a way, it's being filtered. And that's what Aldous Huxley wrote about in his book, The Doors of Perception, where he was trying, I think it was mescaline, and he described basically realizing like our brains are a filtering mechanism. So actually our consciousness can experience way more in any given moment, but we can't handle it. So our brains, most likely our left brain, has to filter it down for us to be able to function. So I'll leave it at that. Elena, what are your
I know,
thoughts?
Nizar, this is I'm I mean, this question is extremely interesting, and indeed, I think science, or just our average understanding, as humanity of what reality truly is or could be, that somehow perhaps is being filtered out for that sense of personal self and sense of personal reality to somehow be preserved within a bubble. There's still, it is just such an unfathomable question how something experience of psychedelics, or not necessarily psychedelics, but again, like, as you, Nizar, were referring to, profound experiences in life, something that is very profound, experience of profound synchronicity of something that is very unlikely to happening, experience of profound vastness, experience of infinity, the overview effect that the astronauts experienced and described when looking on Earth the um, from the outer space, from, you know, the experience of divine, the experience of God, the experience of transcendence, the experience of loss of ego, the experience of near death, of profound universal love, that type of experience that people describe on ayahuasca, the profound, unfathomable, ineffable, universal love and just transcendence of this biology, this biological nature of uh, reality as we think of it. I think it is such a beautifully posed question that is unanswered, and it holds it. I think it's such a gem for science and humanity to be looking into the utilization and proper study. And I accord with John Hopkins and some other places who are studying, and those scientists who are uncovering the necessity and the value that the understanding of the plant medicines and psychedelics and also profound transcendental experience of life can bring to us as humanity, and how can it also transform humanity in many positive ways. Um, what I also find interesting is this sort of like the dose effect, right? The enhanced experience. So we know, let's say for psychedelics, uh, um, there are serotonergic agonists such as psilocybin or LSD that they're specific to, again, we just talk about receptors specific to like serotonin to a 5-HT2A receptors that are largely expressed, so they're localized more to the very outmost layers of human cortex. So like layer 6 or something of the human cortex. So they're very, so evolutionarily, if we think about the brain, it's like it evolves from the reptilian brain, from the very brain stem, you know, reptilian brain, the basal ganglia, to more elaborate connections of the prefrontal cortex, and then these elaborate connections are more advanced by the types of, again, like the myelination of the cortex and the types of communication between different regions of the brain. So if the brain is a processor, experience of driving a Toyota would be different from experience of driving a Ferrari. Like imagine you accessing this extra gadgets you didn't know existed, and your car just like flies off the ground and suddenly you realize that the car that you had was not a car on the wheels, but is suddenly a plane. And maybe suddenly you find an like a button that has access to the ultra speed type of plane, maybe some kind of warp mechanism that just flashes you through time space, and you go through a wormhole into like a different part of the universe. So imagine like a warp engine, right? A warp um, machine that's warping time. So if engineers can right now work on it, uh, imagine if psychedelics do this to our brains. Imagine if we go through a wormhole of perception and somehow we are open, we go through this rabbit hole and we come to a completely different reality. And this completely different reality, we again, it's very hard to tell what is true and how much of it is true. We know, going back to the dose effect idea, the microdosing, the studies on microdosing of, let's say, psilocybin will enhance the experience, the sensual experience, right? The colors will go brighter. Your creativity will be a little enhanced. Like your brain will start just like swiftly moving in more flexible ways. The ego will just start shaking just a little bit, or the ego will be doing more of a dance rather than being restricted to its own old ways. So not complete dissolution, but yet this the spectrum, again, the range of the experience, when the life has somehow become, the sensory experience of life becomes enhanced. Ideas like your flexibility of thinking, the flexibility of perception, the flexibility of cognition could also be a part of that experience, right? So having that in mind, again, I accord with studying of the psychedelics and using the psychedelics in appropriate ways. I think it definitely does something very interesting to our consciousness, and I'm all for conscious expansion. Having that said, certainly we wouldn't be perhaps able to function in the same coherent reality if we were all like walking around on psychedelic trips. So, open-ended question, open-ended answer.
Awesome. Well, just wrapping up here, any last thoughts that either of you guys have with anything that was discussed today? Anything that's burning on your guys' mind that you still want to get out there?
I think to me, there's so much is burning. We can talk about this subject for hours, right, Nizar? But
Yeah,
I'll leave it for
I don't
1
have.
hour episode.
Okay.
Um, you know, thank you for doing what you do, Toby, and
Yeah,
bringing it
thanks.
here.
Absolutely. What if people want to connect with either of you guys? I don't know if Elena, if you want people to be able to connect with you. I know Nizar, you have the coaching. Do you want to share how people can connect with you?
Yeah, I do one-on-one coaching, and as Toby mentioned, I also do webinars, which I need to get back into doing more frequently. But I think the best way is to follow my Instagram, which is at Taki_MD, TAKI_MD. And then my website is www.taki.coach.
And your OnlyFans is what again?
Oh yeah, good name for that one. You can post it in the show notes.
Of course, of course. And Elena, I'm not sure if you want people to be able to connect with you. If you do, you can.
Yeah, I think I definitely want people to connect with me if they're interested in any kind of questions that we were talking about today. I don't have so a good like social platform. I guess people can probably connect with me maybe a tweet on Twitter that I signed up for yesterday. It's my first name Elena _, my last name Buglo, which you can probably have like in comment section. I'm definitely working on starting a YouTube channel and an Instagram for this kind of content, but Twitter will probably work for now.
Great. Great. And if you guys enjoyed the show today, go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us at Roscoe's Wetsuit, and all of the audio podcasts are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and just about anywhere else that audio podcasts are available. So again, I wanted to thank each of you for coming on the show today. This was a really interesting new way of having two guests on. So really enjoyed talking with you guys today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Toby. Let's definitely do it again soon.
Yes, we will definitely do a part 2, part 3. All right.